Excuse that, that's not even
En net, die laaste slukkie.
Goeiemorgen, good morning. And I suppose Dumela would be in place as well. En ek dink vir party moet ons dalk vanmôre in 'n foreign language speak. Ek sien Roelof het vanmôre begin met 'n polisiekoffie. So ek sien baie uit na hierdie gesprek. Ek dink dit gaan 'n interessante en 'n insightful. Kyk, niks positief kom tot stand sonder meningsverskille nie. Dis maar so. It's only when you live on the edge and if you meaningful disagree with somebody that there can be progress. Ons is in 'n interessante besigheid, landbou en die landbouwaardeketting. It has performed in the last few years unbelievably. And if I look at the faces in the room, it's certainly some of the movers and shakers in agriculture. And I really look forward to your participation. Maar Theo, waarskynlik een van ons beleggingsanaliste wat die beste ingelig is oor landbou. And if you listen to yesterday's two sessions that we had, you would understand why. Uitstekende reaksie en thank you to our panel. Belangrik dat julle weet, ons betaal hulle nie. So hulle doen dit uit liefde, uit vir die Right, we'll shoot. So Derek Matthews, baie geluk weer eens 'n uitstekende program. En ek dink die krag wys maar hoe gewild is dit, nee. Baie meer mense wat gekom het en baie meer belangstelling. So ons hoop daai julle kry die kragmoeilikheid ook opgelos. Hulle is totaal overload met die uitstallers wat hier is. Sterkte, geniet die sessie. Theo, baie dankie en vir die paneellede. Ons sien uit na die gesprek.
Baie dankie, François. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, welcome from my side. It is brilliant that you all here, that you made the time. And then the people watching on the digital platforms, welcome. Note that all of this will be available on the various digital platforms. So if there's something you miss or we want to look at it again, you are welcome. So to those of you on the digital platform, welcome. I did receive one question. So if there's any other questions on the platform, there is the facility to send questions to me. That will be relayed to me and I will pick it up on my cell phone. So if I look at my cell phone from time to time, it's not to, as I said yesterday, it's not to see if I may have won some kind of lottery in Nigeria or inherited some money somewhere in Sudan or something. It is more to do with to make sure there's no question. Then Derek, thank you very much. Derek is the chairperson of Grain SA. This is a Grain SA, Nampo belongs to Grain SA, and I think, Derek, we hope that this will become a part of the agricultural calendar as the same way that Nampo and Botawil is part of the agriculture calendar. So thank you and well done to you and your team. It is a privilege to be part of this. Today the discussion, or this discussion, is the first one of 3 discussions today. This is specifically about the economy, economic challenges. We live in a very uncertain world. There is variables. There is players that make it even a bit more difficult for us to take a position on. So let me firstly introduce my panel. But before I do that, we will have a discussion for about 40 to 45 minutes. I will then allow for questions, depending how the questions go. We will either come back to the panel or spend time on the questions. Roelof has a flight to catch, so he needs to be out of here by 11:30. Unfortunately, the power situation is not really assisting us, but let's work around that. Let me introduce my guests from my left to my right, just so everybody knows who they are. I think none of these guests really needs introduction, but to my left is Dawie Rood, Chief Economist at the Efficient Group. Dawie, welcome. Then Madeleine Sessions, he's a portfolio manager at Denker Capital. Madeleine, thank you very much. Pleasure. Professor Rolf Botha, independent economist and also economic advisor of the Optimum Investment Group. And then from the University of Stellenbosch, Professor Andre Jooste. He's a professor in agricultural economics. Andre, I am going to start with you. This is an agriculture area. Most of the people in the audience are either in primary agriculture or in senior decision-making positions in agriculture companies and role players in agriculture. From your point of view, if you look at specifically the agriculture economic environment, what would you highlight, and where are the moving parts?
Well, thank you, Theo. I think it's difficult to decide where to start and where to end when you start talking about agriculture, especially about the economics of agriculture as well. I think what one needs to take into account, if you take a broader picture, is that agriculture is, over and above its low contribution to GDP, which is natural in a developed economy, it contributes in various other ways. It contributes to jobs, it has significant economic multipliers, and it contributes to food security, which is very important, especially if we consider what happened in 2008 and 2009 globally, and we, again, in a very difficult economic situation globally, and agriculture in South Africa contributed to stability. In other words, it's not only, its economic contribution, but also its social contribution in making sure that there's sufficient food. And if you look at our northern African countries, food was the spark for the Arab Spring there. And then obviously foreign exchange earnings. So if you look at our agricultural sector, as a whole, we've been able to, during COVID, we saw agriculture actually having positive growth. Obviously, agriculture is linked to our climate. Over the last 3 to 4 years, we had good climate conditions. We're seeing our livestock sector now rebuilding their herds, so, quite positive in that sense. We're looking at good grain crops over the last couple of years. And then we look at our fruit exports or our horticultural sector exports, which is excellent and performing really well in terms of our export earnings. In fact, I looked at the export figures yesterday, and the wool industry is contributing the 5th most to our export earnings in the country. So when it comes to challenges, biosecurity is a serious problem, and all our livestock farmers will know with the current FMD outbreak, it is a problem. It's something that really needs to be fixed. Another challenge, especially as far as our export industries are concerned, is what's currently happening within the ambit of Act 36. That's looking at agricultural fertilizers, remedies, and all of that. And then we need to take cognizance of what's happening globally within the ambit of climate change. And, the talks about the Green Deal, and we even see the European farmers going to Brussels and showing the dismay with the Green Deal and what's happening there. But the fact is, that's something that we can't manage, and we have to basically play by the rules. And if we look at something like Act 36, I see some serious challenges there if we don't fix what is wrong. Infrastructure, as far as our export markets are concerned, that's also a serious problem. I think there's a lot more that can be done as far as market access is concerned. And maybe we have time a little bit later to go into that a little bit more detail. So overall, I think the agricultural sector is at a good place. Currently, high input costs is a stumbling block, but we know what is the reasons for that: high oil prices, the war in Russia and Ukraine. But at the same time, we're also seeing quite good agricultural prices. So to some extent, they're playing each other off in terms of what's happening at farm level. I think there is however, one big misconception, and we've been looking at the figures over the last 2 to 3 months. If you go and calculate the profitability of agriculture with the available statistics, it's completely overestimated. So it's another challenge that we will have to address, to get our agricultural statistics right so that we can make decisions on the right or the correct information that we have available. So agricultural profits is not that high. I think our economists and our investment bankers will say, when we're looking at a return on investment of anything between 15 and 20%, it's a good investment. In many of our sectors, we're not there, and we're seeing those changes taking place. In addition to that, we're moving in a very fast environment where we have technological change. Our consumers are getting more sophisticated, and the agricultural sector needs to adapt in that environment. And I think if we look at our farmers in this country, I think they're absolutely brilliant in their ability to adapt in this very difficult environment, and I think they need to be applauded for that.
I totally agree with you. Davy, if you look at the world economy, and I'm going to start with the world economy and slowly work our way back to the South African economy. In the world economy, what would you say are the major variables currently in play?
Dankie to you. Well, obviously there are many things. There are many moving parts in the world, and everything affects everything else. But there are two things I would like to point out. The one is that Andre referred to that, and that is the current conflict in Central Europe. Now, that's having a huge impact on commodity prices, hard commodity and soft commodity prices. And I have a suspicion that this conflict is going to go on for a very long time. I know recently that the Ukraine made some significant advances, but I don't think, like for example, the Crimea area, or known as Crimea in the west, but the Russians called it Krim, and the Donbas area, I can't see that the Russians is going to give that up in any way whatsoever. So I think what we're going to see is a long, protracted war, which will have the effect that commodity prices are likely to remain relatively high. Of course, it can escalate into something much worse, but the relatively high commodity prices and gradually drift lower. I think that's the most likely scenario.
But the war, this conflict will be with us for longer than everybody
it's going to be.
for.
I think it's inevitable. If there is going to be peace, Zelensky simply will have to accept that he's going to lose part of his territory. I cannot see how the Russians will give the Crimea area or the Donbas area back. So that means a long, many years of war, I guess, leading to relatively elevated commodity prices. That's important to understand. And of course, we've recently, the global economy started opening up in an environment with exceptionally accommodative monetary policy, and the result of all of this, a combination of all of that, led to this very high levels of inflation internationally. So we have got inflation as a major problem, and the first time in many decades, central banks worldwide are faced with this major problem of inflation. And what I'm very concerned about, inflation expectations are gradually going up as well, which means is that central banks got two jobs. They have to mechanically force inflation down, and secondly, they have to psychologically get people to believe that they're going to be successful in that. So they're losing on both those two ends. But the result of that is central banks are tightening monetary policy through the withdrawal of liquidity and increasing interest rates, and that's leading to all sort of bad things mostly. That leads to a slower economic growth, and I think countries like, for example, the Europeans, for other reasons as well, but they're going to go into a recession. The Americans probably as well. World economic growth is going to slow down quite significantly. And as the Americans especially, if they increase interest rates, and they're quite aggressive, when they increase interest rates, the dollar goes up, and if the dollar goes up, other things goes down. Like, for example, the South African currency, the rand. So that's a global environment. It's an environment that is changing rapidly. It's an environment that's not good for financial markets. I think my colleague will probably refer to that. It's not good for financial markets, and it's also probably not good, especially for emerging economies like South Africa.
Madeleine, you work in the investment area. Now, we started the year with the variable of inflation, GDP growth that's starting to get stronger, and the central banks had a challenge with this. And then Ukraine happened. And this whole puzzle started to get a bit more shaken, a bit more difficult. From an investment specialist, a portfolio manager, in terms of making decisions in this environment, what kind of methodology and how do you go about making investment decisions?
So I think the first thing to remember if you're in investments, and actually it's not just investments, I think if anyone who allocates capital, capital is cowardly. That is the first thing to remember. So when there are limited risks and there are lots of opportunities, capital comes out to play. And when risks are elevated,
Capital disappears. And I want to make just another point on that. I think there's a whole generation of investment bankers and fund managers and portfolio managers that grew up from 2008 with cheap available cash.
Absolutely.
And that kind of distorted thought processes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so what I think is appropriate, both for me as a professional investor, but also for anyone who is allocating hard investment decisions, investments in physical capacity, machinery, equipment, the question isn't what's going to happen in the future. The question is, how many of the potential risks can I mitigate so that I have a resilient business no matter what the future holds? So, I mean, I happen to agree with Davy. I think we're in for a protracted conflict in Ukraine, simply that there's no benefit for anyone for a distinctive victory or a clear victory. So I think everyone who is involved there, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, do not want a distinctive loss for Russia and no clear victory for Russia. And so it's obvious that we'll be in there for a long haul messy with severe consequences for Ukraine. And now you say, as an investor, with that in the back of my mind, I want to be okay. So I want to take risks in a way that doesn't mean tomorrow isn't available for me. So my capital needs to be cowardly because that's the only way my capital remains intact. So I think the global environment, we've been very comfortable that whatever macroeconomic risk, pandemic, you put it on the table, there's always been this underwrite from the Fed. We will make sure that capital earns attractive returns and that there are no losses sustained. That aspect of Federal Reserve monetary policy is no longer an option. We need to decide, is inflation a priority? If inflation is a priority, the Fed can't underwrite asset values. Those are two mutually exclusive outcomes. And so we need to be very cautious in how we allocate capital, I think. But with risk comes opportunity. And so those who are brave enough, who have unique insights, valuable insights, who can create value for society will benefit, and capital ideally should be available to them. But they will fight harder for a slice of more difficult to attain capital.
I'm going to take that one step further. Somebody at some point, I don't know who said it in the discussion, said that capital is like a kudu bull, a big horned kudu bull. There's a reason why he's got the big horns. He's shy, he runs away, you don't see him often. And that is what capital is about. My question to you is, if you, and I'm going to turn directly now to South Africa, and then I'm going to come to Roelof. If you look at our bond yields currently, and you look at the real return the bond yields offer relative to other instruments, does it account for the risk of inflation and the risk of the sovereign issuer of that capital, given the real return you can earn?
You know, we're in this very unfortunate position that all asset returns are relative. So my answer could well be no, but that's not enough. The question is, what else do you do? So there are a lot of people who think that bond returns are very attractive, and they draw you a chart of bond returns in the last 20 years, and they say, look, bond returns and real returns are at the highest that they have been in the last 20 years. What they don't tell you is that the fiscus is also in the worst shape that it has been in the last 20 years. So sure, you are lending at a relatively higher rate than you used to lend to the sovereign, but the sovereign is no longer the sovereign of 2002 with 23% debt to GDP. We are a sovereign with debt to GDP heading sort of north of 80%, and talking about a basic income grant, and no clear consolidation path, and really only getting to 80% because of a fiscal windfall largely driven by not a single policy initiative in South Africa, driven by policymakers in the US. We must not underestimate how useful the US Congress has been for South African growth in the last 2 years. They have done far more for our outcomes than any of our local politicians have done. So bond yields are attractive relative to their own history, but the history is not what it used to be. So we are not the same country with the same prospects as we were. But actually, there's very little else available. You can lend to the US government at 3-ish and 3.5-ish%, and their fiscus and their growth prospects don't look much better than ours, actually. And you can lend to our government at, say, 10-ish and ish, but 10-ish. But again, we are not the sovereign that used to have very low debt, paying back debt, and very fast growth prospects. So, yes and no.
All right, that's Roelof, I want to come back to the South African economy, and you do thorough analysis of the underlying economy in South Africa. And we all live in this country, and we all make our investments and our well-being and our livelihood out of South Africa. Your view of this, of South Africa, where it's currently, and the prospects going forward.
Ja, ek gaan nou maar 'n bietjie Afrikaans op praat.
Ja.
Sê ons gaan altyd maar.
Ja.
Ek wil net vir hierdie dame very eloquent, by the way, and I agree with most of what you said, but there are too many fund managers on this panel, by the way. As far as I'm concerned.
I think I'm the only one.
Well, he works for one, and he's also one, as far as I'm concerned.
So there's only two knowledgeable, independent people here.
Jy kan bly wees enig Kodongwana is nie hierson nie. Because our public finances is not in the worst shape that it's been in 20 years. We stabilized our public debt GDP ratio, and all three the ratings agencies upgraded our debt. So quite frankly, I disagree with you totally as far as that's concerned. Nou kom ons kyk na die syfers. 3% opbrengs op Amerikaanse staatseffekte, 8.3% inflasiekoers. So jy boer agteruit teen 'n ontstellende pas. In Suid-Afrika 10% op jou staatseffek, 7% inflasie, not bad going. Maar in Maart 2020, toe die mark so geduik het, wie onthou April 2020? Ek is amper gearresteer toe ek op my grasperk gedraf het. Dis ernstig. When the command council was in charge, if you remember that? I mean, relativity is a great comfort, isn't it? Iemand sê vir my daai tyd, sê vir my, you know, those people in the command council are so narrow-minded. If they look through a keyhole, they use both eyes. But you can guess which one it was. Apparently she wants to run for president, but anyway. Om nou net terug te kom na die kwessie van die binnelandse ekonomie, wat ons net moet onthou, Net een of twee vinnige aanmerkings oor die politiek en die ekonomie. Cyril Ramaphosa, die ANC onder Cyril Ramaphosa, nie soos wat hy nou is nie, want onthou, hy het Jacob Zuma se gemors geërf. Hy het al daardie, I was diplomatic now, pathetic, useless, incompetent people. Okay, dis nie te bad nie, nee. Hy het hulle geërf. En toe het hy vir elkeen van hulle, onthou julle hoe lank het gevat vir die kabinet om aangekondig te word. Hy het elkeen van hulle vir nagte lank tot middernag het hy daar gesit en vir hulle verduidelik. Hierdie performance agreement, 17 bladsye. Ek het Mantasha se gesien. Hy gaan sy gat sien in elk geval. Want hy het niks gedoen wat hy moes gedoen het nie. Ek meen, waar kom hy by die 1 megawatt? Jy weet, 'n paar ure later sê president, nou, jy made a mistake, it's 100 megawatt, jy weet. Na Desember, nie as nie wanneer Ramaphosa weer verkies word, dan gaan ons nuwe bloed sien. Hy is besig om met die gemors wat Zuma veroorsaak het, om dit stadig maar seker reg te maak. Alles wat hy gedoen het in reverse te sit. And if anybody has an inkling of sympathy for Zuma, please remember this. If it had not been for the fact that he Zuma himself, and people like Molefe who's been arrested, they stopped in its tracks the renewable energy program for 7 years. If it wasn't for that, we would almost be finished by now. We would not have load shedding, quite frankly. So quite frankly, yes, we are in the doldrums as far as many things are concerned, but slowly but surely we are starting to fix things. And by the way, the main cause of inflation, when I realized that we have lower inflation than Germany and the United States, I had to dig really deep. And then I saw the Statista Freight Rate Index went from September 1919, $1,200 for a 40-foot container, to 10,000 2 years later. 800% increase in shipping freight. 80% of all tradable goods are shipped by the ocean. And that's the main cause. That thing is dropping like a stone. So whatever happens in the Ukraine, and Dawie has good knowledge about that. He was there recently. It's a pity they send you back. I'm just kidding, Dawie. I think Dawie and myself were both hoping the other one misses the plane. You know? But in fact, we agree on a couple of things. I expect, and a lot of analysts that I read, the American inflation rate has peaked already. What happened this week with a lowering of the CPI and a marginal increase in the bond yield was totally out of kilter. But there are so many Mickey Mouse scared fund managers globally, and the minute they're a little bit concerned about Ukraine and this and China locking up again and things like that, then they run for the hills. And what are the hills? What's behind the hills? Dollar bonds. In March 2020, when you all know what happened, I sold my Opel Corsa second-hand. I had a couple of bucks in my money market account. Don't tell SARS, please. And I sold a painting, and I borrowed some money. And I bought Cecil at 30 Rand. So the opportunities, I think you spoke about opportunities. I don't know who else, but I mean the opportunities right now. Some of our blue chip shares, like I don't want to punt companies necessarily, but you know they are Kumba, African Rubber Minerals, Exaro, etc. Exaro now is a little bit expensive, but the rest of them, you're talking about price-earnings ratios in the vicinity of 5. What is the average on the S&P, Dawie? 36?
No, it's much lower now.
It's not there anymore.
Much lower, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, but it's still a multiple
it's 5 times
of
what
some
you're
of
talking
our
about
blue
now.
chip companies.
It's 5 times what you're
Yeah.
talking about.
And
now.
dividend, let's go to dividend yields.
Yeah.
What's your average dividend yield in Europe? In real terms, probably
No, not
negative
real
right
terms,
now.
negative.
In South Africa, if you see me smiling for no apparent reason, I'm thinking of my Kumba dividend. But you must stick it out there. You mustn't invest for the short term. I mean, investing with fund managers is not like a roulette at all. The records that were broken in COVID is unbelievable. Construction, material, wholesale sales, real terms, new record. Leading business cycle indicator, new record. Agbus, IDC confidence indicator in agriculture, new record. Die APSA, BER, julle manne daarso, né? Hulle vertrouensindeks in vervaardiging het nou onlangs ook 'n nuwe rekord behaal. Ons uitvoere, dan is daar jy het gepraat van die winsgewendheid en ek stem saam met jou, die Stats SA data is 'n bietjie one has to be suspicious about that, but the fact is that the latest data shows that agricultural value added is at hit an all-time new record, and their gross value added as a percentage of their output also hit a new record. Not to mention exports. When your exports go from 1.1 trillion in 2020, which was the second highest ever, the first year of COVID, to 1.7 trillion in the second year of COVID, that's not bad going. And it wasn't just the American politicians, quite frankly, it was the super cycle in commodities, and it was the fact that in volume terms, we were exporting more agricultural products and more processed food products. One of the reasons inflation is lower than the rest of the world, we have the most diversified agricultural sector of any emerging market, and I think Andre will agree with me. In South Africa, you don't have to wait. Something doesn't have to travel for 30,000 kilometers on a ship before you can buy it in a supermarket. Laat my dink aan checkers, nee, net om die hoek. The farmer and the food processor is around the corner. And there's no substitute for food. So agriculture and mining carried us through this, the COVID years. And now the big guns, financial services, look at what they did in the second quarter. They did very well. Personal services, growing like a rocket. And all of us have been forced to know what the fourth industrial revolution actually means. So quite frankly, I cannot think that anybody would want to be anywhere else in the world than in the Western Cape.
That is, Andre, before I come to Davy, because I'm going to ask you your view on the South African economy, but Andre, first of all, if you look at, you talk about agriculture economics and the, what are the major challenges in terms of, we know that, and I'm going to stick to the Western Cape, yesterday we had the Ports Authority telling us that the volume of fruit being produced in the Western Cape is going to go up by about 26% in the next 4 years, which, if you carefully think, means there's pressure on the whole system. Where are the challenges? And I want to specifically talk about the challenges in terms of agriculture, and let's move a bit more towards the Western Cape.
Now, Theo, I think if you touched upon a very important one, and that is our port infrastructure, which we have serious challenges with, and I think there was private investors that said that they would buy into the port and assist with the management of the port, but unfortunately, national government doesn't like that too much, and the challenge with that is now our local government is starting to look at other ports elsewhere, which means that fruit and your perishable products have to be exported over longer distances, and with all of the troubles associated with that. So I think infrastructure is a serious issue. Secondly, our available water, if we look at it within the Western Cape, there is a lot of people from other provinces migrating into the Western Cape, and I had a discussion with some, let's call it policy makers within the Western Cape, and the estimate is that we're going to see over the next 5 to 6 years an additional 1 million people moving to that side of the Hottentots-Holland Mountains. So where are they going to get housing? Where are they going to get water? So the water issue, because that will compete, agriculture will have to compete for that water in the wine and fruit producing areas. I think what we've seen over the last couple of years, which is a risk, is the labor situation. How do we manage our labor? How do we get our labor more productive in the Western Cape, and basically prevent social unrest in these high value production areas, because the losses is serious when they start burning down pack houses and that kind of thing. So if I have to highlight the major challenges, infrastructure, what's going to happen with our water, and then we need to make sure that we have good practices as far as our labor is concerned. Those are the things that some of them are manageable and some of them are not manageable, but we need to figure out how we're going to do that.
I want to pick up, before I go back, I want to pick up the notes that were made on the assumption that the challenge or the incursion, depending whose view you take, but the war in the Ukraine. What is there? Let's assume that war will continue longer than we were hoping for. What is the impact on agriculture from an economic point of view?
I think, and David referred to it, in addition to what's happening globally with the economy and the US dollar, our exchange rate is depreciating. So for an export farmer in this year, when the exchange rate depreciates, it means greater returns. However, like Michael Porter warned us or stated, is that you should not base your competitiveness on a depreciating exchange rate, because next year you're going to buy your inputs at much higher prices. And if we look at our chemical industry, probably in the region of 96% of our chemicals are being imported. Fertilizers, probably between 80 and 90%, if it's not higher, are being imported. So, you know, input costs are going to be a serious challenge in this country, over and above all the other things that we have been talking about. So input cost is something farmers can manage. They can't manage their prices in the market. It's a free market system. Let me state that in inverted commas. So inputs are going to be a serious challenge going forward. And we need to see whether we're going to see a drop in input costs if our exchange rate or the world starts to stabilize. We can go back to 2008-9 and look what happened to input prices then. Our fertilizer prices went through the roof, chemicals, fuel prices, which is another serious problem. And then after the 2008-9 economic crisis, we saw those prices stabilize globally. So they came down and they started, and even if you look at the long-term trend, some of those prices started moving slowly downwards. In the case of South Africa, it came down, but it didn't follow the same trend as we saw internationally due to our exchange rate. So it basically moved flat. So we didn't get the benefit of what's happening on global markets due to a poor exchange rate. So why do I focus on input costs? Because that is something that farmers can manage on farm, and farmers are really creative, and let me not say creative, innovative in managing the input costs. New technology comes in, a new way of doing things, minimum tillage as an example, etc. So there are a number of ways of managing your input costs, and I think that should be a serious focus for any farmer going forward, given the fact that you have prices that are determined in the free market. I think something that I should also just mention is technology on the output side are also going up. If we look at our maize area planted, it's going down, or since deregulation at least it's going down, but our maize yields up per hectare are picking up.
And the volume produced.
The same with wheat. We're seeing new cultivars coming in the horticultural industry to service the more sophisticated demand elsewhere in the world. One of the big challenges, for example, in the citrus industry, there's tremendous growth that we're seeing. We need to get the markets opened overseas, otherwise we're going to sit with a serious problem in South Africa. That fruit will have to stay here. The investment costs are just so high that they can't afford not to have
and the
those
local
markets.
market is not big enough to take up any surpluses. Our whole fruit industry is based on a foreign buyer. Davie, the local economy, your view in terms of variables, in terms of where we're heading.
I just want to say that, broadly speaking, I agree with the views on agriculture. I think there are 4 industries that I absolutely love, and agriculture certainly is one of those. So more from a global perspective. Locally, we've got certain challenges politically mostly. I just want to make a comment about the capital market in South Africa. South Africa's foreign debt, or state foreign debt, is actually quite low. So if you look at the return of in fact, you can get as much as 11% on bonds in South Africa. The only real risk is not the default, because they're not going to default. It can only be inflation. So I think that is the only real risk. And in fact, that's what I think we are heading to. And for reasons that I totally disagree with Rudolf, for example. I must disagree with you because you're just wrong. And let me give you some numbers. Is that if you look at the fiscal accounts, for example, is that there are a couple of issues. So like for at the moment, the fiscal accounts, the revenue is doing better than expected, but we're still running a fiscal deficit in excess of 5%, and it's likely to stay there. The pressure on the fiscus in terms of spending at all sort of levels is just increasing. It's not going to come down. The debt levels at the moment is in excess of 80% to GDP. And the only way that you can repay this sort of debt eventually over time is through inflation. I can't see how we will be able to not repay it through inflation. Some good news certainly for South Africa is that we've got somebody like the Setsukanyago, the central bank. We started relatively early in the cycle to tighten monetary policy. And a bit of luck, the commodity cycle was also good to support the exchange rate of the currency. But commodities are likely to slowly drift lower, I guess. And I guess we're already running a current account deficit, which would probably bob back to surplus again. But soon, next year or so, the current account will dip into a deficit, and then we're going to see a much weaker currency again. But the major issue in South Africa is that you have to look at politics. So we don't, for all practical purposes, we don't have a government at the moment. We don't have a government at the moment because there's so much infighting because they want to figure out who's going to be in the next leadership. And then, of course, 2 years from now, we've got a general election. So government is just absent. We just don't have a government. And if you look at the South African government, I get a sense it's a mixture between two things. It's a mixture between criminality and incompetence, which includes the president, by the way. We've got an exceptionally weak president. Every now and again, they do make the right move. But it's like, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, you can always expect the Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted all the alternatives. And that's what the South African government is doing. They're basically privatizing everything, not because that is in policy of government, it is simply because the state is just collapsing. I can give you all the examples. We've privatized the post office for all practical purposes because it's been run into the ground financially and operationally. We're in a process of privatizing Eskom. We've already privatized South African Airways. Not privatized in a normal
I understand what you mean.
but the private sector is simply taking over because we don't have a government in South Africa. And in a weird kind of way, in a perverse kind of way, there's a lot of opportunities there. And agriculture is exactly grasping many of these opportunities. There are opportunities in terms of infrastructure. Infrastructure, what the state is supposed to provide, can now be provided by the private sector. But it's such a waste, it's such a shame, actually, that we were paying our taxes, and now the state is simply not coming to the fore to provide that kind of infrastructure. Let me make a prediction. We have 32 million people receiving an income from the state. Let me repeat that number. We have 32 million people getting an income from the state every month. 10 million of them, I don't think it's going to happen, but supposed to lose that COVID income in March next year. We've got just over 60 million people, of course, if you can, people in a country, depending on whether you want to believe in stats numbers or not. The fiscal accounts have become unsustainable. The whole thing is going to fall over. The local authorities are a mess. The parasitals are a mess, all of that. In this environment, you've got record high levels of unemployment, rising levels of poverty, not only poverty, absolute poverty. We are sitting on something that's going to explode. In this environment, electricity or energy prices are going up, and more importantly, food prices are going up. We're waiting for a spark and this country is going to explode. We have to be aware of that. I don't think we're going to see a revolution, but we're going to see the country, we're going to see running battles in the streets. We've already seen that. We have to be aware, and that's my biggest concern. And this is happening in an absence of any proper political leadership.
Madlet, from an investment point of view, if you talk, there is, we talked about the yield, but if you talk about the real underlying economy in South Africa, and Rudolf made the point that certain of our major competitive international companies are actually showing great value. And that will go not only for the market, but for the economy as a whole, the investments in South Africa incorporated. What's your view on that in terms of risk return?
Yeah, so it's going to be a long answer. So I was on a different panel yesterday, and I was very, sort of stayed with me, so I want to share this fact. Over the last 120 years, the three best equity markets for performance was Australia at number one, number second was the US, and thirdly, I think, was South Africa. And it was like 1 or 2 basis points between us and the US. At the start of the last century, so the turn of the previous century, so 1900s, 1899 type, South Africa was 3.5% of global market cap. In other words, 3.5% of all equity value resided in South Africa. The US was about, I'm going to lie, but I think sort of mid-teens, and the UK was in the mid-20s. And when the study was recently published, the US had grown from mid-teens to over 50%. And South Africa doesn't get a mention. We're less than 1%. But we delivered the same returns to the investor in hard currency as the US did. What we didn't do was create widespread wealth. So what the US did was created a lot of companies delivering good returns. South Africa created a very small number of companies that generated good returns. And so opportunity lies even without economic growth. You can earn really attractive returns in a market even if that market doesn't generate widespread wealth and opportunity. So I think that's an important point. Ideally, we would live in an economy that created lots of wealth for lots of people. And this is where I think the two panelists on my side, it's nice for them to borrow me, but what we do at denken and sort of fundamentally believe is important is we don't disagree about the facts. We put the facts on the table, and then we don't even argue about the future. Opinions, as well-informed and well-argued as they are, is just that, well-argued opinions. What we're trying to do is say there are a number of futures possible, and how do we make sure that we provide returns to our investors in as many of those futures as possible? So we want to really create a diversified wealth portfolio. I think that is possible in South Africa. You can create a portfolio that will deliver attractive returns no matter what happens to the future of South Africa. And I want to just talk to Rolof's earlier point about South Africa. I think it's really important to distinguish the individuals from the system. Economies like the US that goes from an emerging market 120 years ago to an economy that has created the most wealth and prosperity in the history of humanity is a system that works. Creative destruction is happening there. An economy like ours that was really developed, that had an exchange rate more valuable than the dollar, but that has not retained its place in the world market, is a system that is, in what way, shape, or form is potentially unclear to us, but it is clearly inferior. And we need to reform our system to create more widespread wealth. It's very difficult to see that reform is happening. And it's very hard to put your faith in individuals who need to act against their self-interest to deliver on that reform. So I just want to disagree with Roloff a little bit, while agreeing that what we have today in the individuals is superior to what we had a decade ago. But it is not necessarily enough to give us very widespread wealth creation and economic prosperity.
Rolof, ek gaan na jou toe terugkom, maar ek wil I want to change the focus from your point of view. I know that you do quite a bit of work on the agriculture sector. Your view, you have a senior agriculture economist next to you, but your view in terms of the South African economy in the next few years, and where does agriculture fit into that from an economic, broader perspective?
Yeah, well, it's been said that an eternal optimist believes we live in the best of all possible worlds, and an eternal pessimist like Darby fears this is true. No, but I mean, and by the way, he's become a lot more positive than in the past. But this story about jy weet die vonk wat nou gaan ontplof, daai ding vertel jy nou al vir 20 jaar lank. En die feit van die saak is dat as Fitch en Moody's en S&P meer positief is oor die land se toekoms as mense in Suid-Afrika, dan moet jy begin vraagtekens vra daar. Everybody is entitled to their own opinion, of course, but not to their own facts, outside of North Korea, of course. Maar jy weet regtig wat ek het 'n sinnetjie nou net begin wat ek nie klaar gemaak het nie. Die ANC onder Ramaphosa en die ANC onder Zuma is soos twee verskillende partye. Wie van julle onthou die ou nasionale party? The old National Party was split in the middle. You had the verligtes and you had the verkramptes. It got so bad that Andrew Stirling formed his own political party. Before him, Herzog, but that was because he didn't want TV. That was crazy, 1970, but anyway. So, maar nou die, jy weet hulle sê, daar's 'n pragtige uitdrukking, bekend is bemind. En dis een van die redes hoekom ons almal nog hier is ek reg? Dis 'n baie breë begrip. Al is bekend, nou nie presies wat jy wil hê dit moet wees, of soos wat jy gedink het dit sou wees nie, of so dit was in die ou dae nie. Maar hier het ons die geleentheid om daai bekende weer mooi te maak, om daai dowwe kan weer 'n bietjie blinker te maak. En die geleenthede is legio. As jy net kyk na die jy die woord innovative, jy weet innoverend, die innovering wat jy kry in die landbou. Ek is onlangs was ek bevoorreg om vir die jong boere in Brits by hulle te gaan gesels saam met Dr. Theo die Jager. En by the way, Theo die Jager is bekend vir daai uitdrukking. Hy het gesê capital is like an impala in the bush.
Okay.
If you scare it, it runs away, latching on to what you said just now. Maar as jy kyk wat in daai omgewing, Madibeng is die swakste munisipaliteit in die land, by the way. As jy daar ry met julle deespleisies kry, dit stink verskriklik. En wat hulle daar reg kry, hulle boer met enigiets wat jy aan kan dink. Hulle voer blomme uit. Daar's 'n koos van splinter. Hy's 'n Hollander. Sy pa het hierna toe gekom vakansie in die Weskaap met sy twee hoërskool, sy dogter en sy seun. Hulle het verlief geraak op Suid-Afrika, klaar matriek geskryf in Holland en hierna toe geëmigreer. Daai ou het daai Jotimal Flora daar buite Brits. Hy voer blomme uit na Europa toe hulle die bissies bewe. Hy skatryk. Die geleenthede is regtig daarso. Die ekonomie, hierdie vervlakste inflasie wat opgegaan het in die rentekoerse nou wat ons 'n bietjie druk. Dit was nou lelik, maar as inflasie vinnig kan piek, dan kan dit oor 'n paar maande van nou af regtig heelwat beter gaan. En nou baie belangrik. As jy vat nou al hierdie 20 megawatt van hierdie company en 200 van Anglo American en Sasol dink ek gaan 500 megawatt instoot. En daar's omtrent elke week daar's nou 'n groot bank wat nou net aankondiging gemaak het oor 200 megawatt aanlegte wat waarskynlik binne 8 maande gaan krag in die netwerk verskaf. En die infrastruktuur om dit moontlik te maak is besig om te gebeur. Julle kan maar gaan kyk na die Afrimaat konstruksieindeks wat hierdie week vrygestel is. Hy is besig om sy kop op te tel. So stadig maar seker, as jy die so stroompies in 'n rivier. Dit kom hier in en oor omtrent 12 maande van nou af gaan ons waarskynlik met 'n bietjie geluk en ek weet ek steek my nek uit, gaan ons waarskynlik as daar beerkrag is, sal dit net fase 2 wees. Ek meen dit is nie was vir daai vervoerband met die steenkool nie. By Camden het ons nie nou dis so swak die onderhoud was. So en ons net een ding onthou, die DA sal nooit Limpopo regeer nie. Ek dink nie hulle wil nie. Hulle sal nooit KwaZulu-Natal regeer nie. Maar 'n ANC waarin daar meer bevoegdheid is, wat luister na die privaat sektor. Ek het op 'n berig geval in Februarie toe Cyril Ramaphosa sy Sondag gesê en hy het gesê in soveel woorde, die enigste manier waarop Suid-Afrika terug gaan na daai 4 jaar van 5% reële groei. Daar wie jy onthou dit net 2003, 2007, dis toe ek die kompetisie gewen het. Jy het hom daarna gewen, né? Die enigste manier waarop ons kan teruggaan soontoe, en by the way, ek dink ons het iets soos 5 miljoen werksgeleenthede geskep in daai 4 jaar, is as die private sektor, hy het min of meer gesê, oorneem. Ons moet hulle luister. Maar nou sit hy met kabinetsministers wat nie 'n klou het waaroor hy praat nie. Want hulle is kaders. En die kaderontplooiing is stadig maar seker besig om ontbind te word. En mense is seker maar ongeduldig. And you said there's no signs. There are so many visible signs. And I'll send you to JP Landman. He's keeping track of them, right? Of where you see a 180-degree turnaround from what we had, which was absolutely no economic policy whatsoever. Julle weet wanneer Zuma lieg, né? So sy lippe beweeg. So quite frankly, if you look at economic policy can make or break a country. Think of Zimbabwe. Think of Venezuela. 2 countries with incredible resources. They should be emerging markets. Their bonds should be trading. Their bond yield should be lower than ours. They are failed states. Why? Because of nationalization, which is another word for stealing. I actually once asked Irvin Jim when I met him at the ETV studios whether he knows the definition of a communist. He didn't know much about anything, but anyway, I told him, Irvin, a communist is somebody who's got nothing, but he wants to share it with you. And he didn't find it humorous. Now, what I'm trying to say is that if you really analyze our economic policies and what will happen after December, when he can get rid of van hierdie ou hout kan ontslaa raak, gaan ons gaan beter ekonomiese beleid kry. Ons gaan vir elke sektor in hierdie land gaan daar 'n meesterplan wees. Daar is omtrent al klaar wat 7 wat voltooi is. Waarin die privaat sektor vir hulle gaan sê en dis hoekom Sipho Nkosi aangestel is. Die voormalige hoof van Exxaro. Sy bynaam is RTR, Red Tape Producer. Jy kan hom toe gaan en vir hulle sê, kyk, kerels, as julle wil hê die klerebedryf of hierdie vertakking van landbou moet vinniger groei, dan moet julle dit en dit en dit doen. En in die mate wat dit vir hulle moontlik gaan wees, sal hulle probeer om dit te doen en dit gaan lank vat, want dit is maar 'n stadige masjien. Maar werklik, jy weet ons, when you've bottomed out, it's not necessarily then to start digging a hole. You know, daar's 'n bultjie daar, jy moet by hom uitkom. The upside is in take-off mode.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take questions at this point in time. We've got another 10 or so minutes to go. Is there any questions? Anybody with a question? Yes. John?
Thank you. John Hudson from Nedbank. I'd like to ask, if I look at the sector, it's largely export driven. I think we know the numbers, Andre, more than 50% by value is actually exported of what they produce. And therefore, for me, logistics and market access are two critical aspects, amongst all the other things like biosecurity and that. So if we're going to produce more in this country, it's logic that we actually need to export. With a question to the panel, you started to talk about policy, Andre, at one point. Market access, could you maybe touch on that a bit?
Thank you, John.
Yeah, during the Agbus conference, I actually fell off my chair when a senior policymaker that was also part of a panel was asked, or there was a comment from the macadamia industry and said, you know, we're competing in China. We have to pay an import tariff into China of 12%. Australia is now starting to compete with us in China. So what are you going to do about, so we have a 12% disadvantage right from the start. So what are you going to do about it? And this senior government official said, nothing. It's not our business anymore. We're going to focus on other stuff. And it's real concerning when a policymaker in a senior position takes that stance, whilst they know how important it is for our agricultural sector to get market access. And then most of you have seen that table where they usually compare the different countries, and you know, all the countries have little green boxes. It's like a matrix. And South Africa has 1 or 2 green boxes there, meaning that other countries in the world have much better market access in the markets where we are actually competing. So the question is, what are they going to do about it? Now you can start looking at agricultural attachés that we have globally, our DTIC offices, DIRCO offices. Are they well capacitated? Do they know what we are negotiating about? So there's a whole range of issues. Over and above just the policy, it's the bureaucracy or technocrats. How well are they capacitated? What are they doing to ensure that we get good market access and sorting out problems? So one of the issues that we have in South Africa is our capacity, for example, to address SPS matters and to address it in a very timely manner. So over and above that, I just want to make a comment on the pessimist, optimist issue. You know what is the definition of a pessimist? It's an optimist with experience. So I don't know which one of you have the most experience.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Yes, sir.
Meneer die voorsitter, ek wil net die vraag vra. Julle maak baie staat op Ramaphosa. Maar is daar nie 'n wolk wat agterop hang nie? Wat is jou opinie daaromtrent?
Ek gaan vir jou, Rudolf.
Ja, wat daar gebeur het, daar's 'n maatskappy en daar's gesag gedelegeer aan mense met sekere verantwoordelikhede. Daar was 'n veiling geweest, baie ouens het in dollars betaal en die mense wat daar gewerk het, een van die ouens was nie daar nie. Ek dink is Basie beweer of enige aan nie, hy was 'n springbok, nee, maar in elk geval hy moes seker gemaak het dat alles nagekom is. Hy was blykbaar die naweek weg gewees en toe staan 'n inbraak. Dis nie 'n skandaal nie. Kyk 'n bietjie weet vir Ramaphosa gaan aankla. Arthur Fraser. Arthur Fraser het die hele nag by die polisiestasie gesit. Nou Arthur Fraser, ek het baie sterk nuus vir hom. Hy het 'n goeie kans om in die tronk te beland, daai mannetjie. En dis 'n feit. Dit was 'n inbraak, nie 'n skandaal nie. Wat Ramaphosa besig om te doen, ek kan vir julle nou sê, is hy's besig om sistematies elke enkele feite. Dit het gebeur, dat het gebeur, dit gebeur, sodat daar geen aanvegbaarheid hoegenaamd in die hof kan wees nie, indien dit nou die waarheid is. So reg, ek dink ons moet hierdie onderwerp net los.
Net so 'n bietjie agtergrond op dit. Onthou, dit het gebeur in Februarie 2020. Goed. Ramaphosa het die Mufamadi-kommissie aangestel om te kyk na nasionale intelligensie. Die Mufamadi-kommissie het bevind dat nasionale intelligensie se fokus behoort te wees wat is die gevare vir die land, wat is die veiligheid vir die land, wat is die beskerming van die land. Nasionale intelligensie het volgens die Mufamadi-verslag ontwikkel onder Arthur Fraser met een enkele fokus. Hou Jacob Zuma in beheer. Die hele nasionale intelligensie het soontoe gegaan. Mufamadi se verslag kom uit, hy skuif vir Arthur Fraser gevangenisdiens toe, want hy kan hom nie afdank nie. Daar's nie, op daai stadium nie genoeg klagtes toe nie. Arthur Fraser skuif gevangenisdiens toe, hy, in terme van die Mufamadi-verslag, raak hulle ontslaaf van 'n klomp van nasionale intelligensie. Goed? In Oktober, November 2020, onthou ons praat hier 2020, kom die direkteur-generaal na Cyril toe en sê vir hom, pas op, die nasionale intelligensie ouens wat gefire is besig om 'n verslag saam te stel om jou te inkrimineer oor die diefstal wat by jou gebeur het. Cyril sê van hom, maar ek het die diefstal gerapporteer aan generaal Wally Rode, wat hoof is van die VIP-eenheid, en hy het vir my gesê, alles is sorted. Ek weet niks verder hiervan nie. Hy kom toe, en hy helemaal sê, die ding gaan bars een of ander tyd. Wel, toe die takke lekker aan die gang is, toe bars hierdie verslag. Toe gaan Cyril na sy regsmense toe. Die regsmense sê, hierdie aantuigings bly absoluut doodstil. Jou regsadvies is, hou jou bek. Wat gebeur is, Arthur Fraser begin toe die ding warm aanmaak. Hy stuur aan verskillende media, stuur hy verskillende inligting, en hy probeer hier 'n bal aan die gang kry. Cyril se ooreenkoms, volgens wat ek het, en asseblief, moet my nou nie aanhaal nie, hierdie is daai braaivleisgesprekte wat hy nou nie moes gehoor het nie. Die gesprek tussen hom en die ANC is basies, tot tyd en wyl daar nie 'n uitdager is vir my eie posisie nie, moet ek my regsadvies volg. As daar 'n uitdager is vir my eie posisie, dan moet ons begin besluit hoe ons hierop reageer. So, waar ek aansluit met jou is, hy gaan die regte instellings mee kommunikeer, maar tot tyd en wyl hy nie weet presies alles wat Fraser gaan probeer uitlek, wat hy self nie heeltemal van seker is nie, is sy posisie, kry bewyse, want ek kan nie op 'n verslag reageer wat sê tussen 4 en 8 miljoen dollar, en nou lyk my selfs 'n Fraser begin sê, nee, okay, dit was net 'n paar $100,000.
Theo, mag ek inspring? Daar's geen twyfel dat Fraser besig is om vir Ramaphosa die swart te smeer nie, ons weet dit almal.
Nou, hulle twee hou mekaar uit die tronk uit.
Ons verstaan dit, nou. Maar hier is 'n klomp vrae wat regtig waar gaan.
Ja, hier is 'n paar vrae.
Jy weet, waar kom hy in 'n klomp dollars?
Ja.
Weet jy hoeveel dit is nie?
Maar okay, vir 'n begin,
'n klomp kontant?
Ja, maar vir 'n begin is dit nou nie meer 4 miljoen, is nou 'n paar $100,000.
So wat is nou dollars of rand?
Dollars, maar 'n paar, dis...
Ja, maar weet ek mag nie eers $100,000 in my persoon.
Nee, daar is 'n klomp vrae.
So hier is vrae, daar's hierdie tipe volgens maar ek dink die vraag is meer so wat as Ramaphosa op 'n of ander manier uitgeklik
word. Dan het ons 'n ernstige probleem.
En die antwoord daarop is dat die voorhand liggende opvolger op hierdie stadium is David Mabuza. Dis die voorhand liggende opvolger, alhoewel dit lyk hy speel sy kaarte baie naby aan die bors. So, dit lyk my hy, en ek dink...
nie eers sy eie provinsie het hom genomineer nie. Ek meen, Piet nog hierso.
Ja, so dit
is Piet nog hierso. Maar die punt van die saak is, nie eers Didi Mabuza sy eie provinsie het hom genomineer nie.
Ek sê maar
so die wind is...
Nee, ek sê maar net, as Cyril nou iets oorkom, is hy die volgende president, byvoorbeeld. En dan sou 'n klompie ander aanspraakmakers, maar nie een van hulle is 'n sterk aanspraakmaker. So ek dink Cyril Ramaphosa gaan nog steeds die president wees aan die einde van hierdie jaar, en hy gaan daarom die president van die land wees, maar ek het 'n vermoede dat die ANC hopelik onder 50% volgende. Ek moet net 'n opmerking maak, wat jy verkeerd is, né? Ek meen, ons is nie opgegradeer nie. Ons is nie opgegradeer nie. Dis feitelik verkeerd. Die negatiewe vooruitsig is verander, maar dit is nie 'n opgradering. Maar hoe dit ook al sê, om terug te gaan in die politiek deur die ANC, lyk dit vir my Cyril Ramaphosa gaan die pyp nog rook, maar ek is nie so seker of die ANC meer as 50% gaan kry in die volgende verkiesing.
Ek moet net reageer daarop. As jy 'n C kry, nê, vir jou opstel, en jou volgende een kry 'n B, dan is jy opgradeer.
Okay, net gou, ek gaan nou nie net gou op daai. Onthou Didi Mabuza as die adjunkt president van die ANC. Die parlement kies die president van die land. So Didi Mabuza sal president van die ANC wees as dit sou gebeur, maar dis nie outomaties dat die caucus van die ANC hom sal kies. Op die oomblik is die groot bekleierery in die ANC oor die adjunkt president en die direkteur-generaal. Die sekretaris-generaal. Dis die twee bekleierery, en daar's so 4 of 5 name op adjunkt president en daar's 4 of 5 name op sekretaris-generaal. Een ding wat ons sal moet onthou in die verkiesing wat anders werk as vorige jare. Nou in die vorige jare het jy gestem vir die hele sluit, al 6 ouens. Nou om die sluit te breek, gaan jy stem vir die senior posisies, uitsluitend adjunkt president en adjunkt sekretaris-generaal. En die rede daarvoor is dat as jy die een verloor, kan jy weer 'n kans het op die ander ene. Maar ek dink dit is goed. Baie dankie. Nog any other questions? Yes.
Chair, thank you.
Derek.
Mr. Botha, your positivity is infectious, so thank you very much. Davi, your realism is concerning, but it's absolutely necessary that we don't live in cloud 9 when we're positive. So it's I'm really enjoying what I'm hearing from you. My question is this: as farmers, you said that we're innovative, and we are. We are absolutely innovative. I've had the privilege of experiencing agriculture in many countries in the world, and South African farmers are exceptionally innovative. Boer maak 'n plan is something that it's a quality that we possess, which really sets us apart from a lot of farmers in the world. Now, what we as farmers need from in South Africa to survive and to thrive is an enabling environment. When you have an incapable state, what are you going to tell us? How do we either contribute to, how do we bring about an enabled or an enabling environment with an incapable state? You've all said we've been discussing now.
Okay, wait. I'm going to thank you, Derek. I'm going to take one more question, and then I'm going to use this as the final comments on this. There was a question there. Yes.
It's a very basic question I'm going to ask. I haven't been. Can you hear me? Yeah, it's working.
Yes.
And and I haven't been in the country for a while, so I haven't followed it. Are we a net importer of food or a net exporter? Can you comment on that? Net importer or net exporter of food?
Exporter.
Exporter.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're back in the... And can you talk perhaps a little bit about food security in the context of climate change, particularly in South Africa?
Okay, thank you very much. So there's two. Let me do the following. Derek's question is very important in terms of you're a farmer running a business and you're struggling with the state roads, infrastructure, the different laws, requirements, export markets. How do you approach that as a businessman happening to specialize in primary agriculture? But I'm going to start with a question around specifically food security. Just sketch a bit about our food position, and then about food security, climate change, and your views on that.
Yeah, that's a very long topic to discuss, actually. To answer the question, we're a net exporter of food, but we also have to distinguish between whether it's processed or unprocessed products. So on the unprocessed product side, we are doing really well. On the processed side, we are struggling a little bit, which is obviously presents its own challenges. So to be brief, if you look at the new Africa Free Trade Agreement, we're busy with an analysis to see whether there's any opportunities for South Africa. And in many of the regions, they actually have sufficient access, not sufficient access to unprocessed food. So it's a good opportunity for South Africa. On the processed side, we've got a problem as far as that is concerned. Is South Africa food secure? Yes, the answer to that. Is it to any benefit of South Africa? I explained in my opening remarks, it is a huge benefit to have a food secure country so that we don't run into these instability and high social risks. Do we have household food security on a daily basis? No, we have a serious challenge as far as that is concerned. And we don't have the necessary programs to ensure household food security. And I think we can go and learn from the United States. The food stamp system, food banks, we have some food banks, but they're not operating efficiently. So there are mechanisms that can be used to ensure household food security on a daily basis. Can I just quickly respond to what Derek has mentioned? Derek, I think one of the critical aspects of ensuring that government creates an environment where farmers can do business is our institutions. The Grain South Africas of the world, all of the other producer associations, your unions, because those are the people that must leverage the support of the farmers, because a policymaker is not going to listen to Derek if he walks into the office and say, I'm here on my own. He's going to ask, Derek, who are you representing? What are the issues that your farmers have? And bring the solutions to me. One of the biggest challenges that we have from a technocrat or officials in government, they do not understand agriculture. And one way, and I've experienced it myself in my previous employment, is to take a government official, take him to where the tacky hits the tar, show him what is the implications, and then go back to the drawing board and say, but this is what we want actually to be changed in the terms of the regulatory environment. A serious big issue currently that we have, and maybe my fellow colleagues here can assist me in this thinking. We know what is the cost of being in business. We don't know what is the cost of doing business. And we regularly state to ourselves, the cost of doing business is going up. And I'm trying, with a student of mine, now trying to define what is the cost of doing business, and we've perused the literature, and the literature is really weak in this regard. So we're using terminology when we're talking to politicians that we ourselves have not properly defined yet, and more importantly, have not properly quantified. To say, but this is what your poor policy or poor policy implementation environment is causing.
Thank you. I'm going to come, Dawie, then Marlette, and then I'm going to end with you, Roelof. Dawie, the question from
Yeah, I'm not an agricultural economist, so I've got a slightly different take on that. And I just have to start off by, I have to defend my colleague. We need sunshine economists as well. It's important to have both sides of the story.
Thank you.
So, on the food security, let me just make a comment about that. I don't care about food security. There are many countries in the world that are not food secure, but they have other things. They, like Singapore is not food secure, and many other examples of that. They're very wealthy countries. What we need to do is to integrate with the rest of the world. No, of course we need to fix other stuff as well. The rand is supposed to be much stronger. So the point I want to make, all this hype about food security, I don't care about that. You can import it. But of course you need to fix other things. But just a general comment about the nature of economies, and that is economies are gradually evolving and becoming more service orientated, more technologically driven, more digitizable, if you like. And I think perhaps that's part of the answer in agriculture. And that's what we are doing. The real value add, of course, will always happen on the land. But to a large extent, much of the value is actually created in a lab, or much of the lab value is created at universities, for example. And I can give many examples: genetic engineering, precision farming, that sort of stuff. So it's becoming less important. The land is becoming, relatively speaking, less important, but what you do with land is becoming much, much more important. So if you want to be in agriculture today, you can just as well be anywhere else. You can just as well be in finance, you can become an economist, you can be a drone pilot, or whatever the case. It doesn't matter really. And perhaps the important point here is to stop making a distinction between agriculture and the other industries, because agriculture is just one more very sophisticated and a growing business out there, and I don't think we can call it a primary industry anymore, because the value add doesn't really happen. It happens on the land, but the add happens somewhere else. That's a point I want to make.
Thank you. Marlette?
Yeah, so I think there's an old sort of cliche, necessity is the mother of all invention, and I think that's one of the reasons our farmers are so innovative. It's necessary. And I don't think that's going to change. You cannot really hope for change on these key administrative tasks of government where they are failing. So I think if you're hoping that things at government level is going to change, that is a hope that will be perpetually disappointed. It is much better to look to your fellow farmers and other institutions to say, what is it that we can do to solve our own problems? That is a much more likely successful course of action than trying to persuade some policymaker for whom you are not a constituent and for whom you do not represent a key constituency. So there's no influence over his job security or tenure from not listening to you.
Right, I'm going to, just when these guys start to do this at the back, it's not that there's a chopper in the air, it's that finish, get out of here. So we've come to the end of the session. I'm going to give the last word to close off. I haven't gone the round with everybody, so Roelof, last word from you.
Yes, I must just say that agriculture is a strategic industry everywhere in the world. And many of the people in the audience will realize that the worst thing that ever happened to this country's agriculture sector was the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy of Europe, where a French farmer, he doesn't even have to farm, gets 40% of his input costs via subsidies.
He can fly his cow around the world first class every year.
Yes. I mean, even Trevor Manuel at the time
Cow.
made a comment about that. It's absolutely disgusting, and because there's no substitute for food. If you are not food secure, and there are food shortages in the rest of the world, and your currency is not very strong, then you have serious problems with regard to socio-political stability, and that is a fact. So quite frankly, agriculture, as far as I'm concerned, for many reasons, is very, very special. But just to, om net af te sluit, jy weet, ek is deur Hortgrou gevra 'n paar jaar gelede om te praat hier in die Kaap, en toe vra hulle vir my vir die uitnodiging, toe vra hulle vir my, Dr. Botha, gee vir ons 'n lese, L-E-U. Yes, en ek het kop gekrap, en ek het uiteindelik baie mooi gedink hieroor, en ek kom toe met die volgende ding voor 'n dag, en dis waarmee ek wil afsluit. 'n Skouer aan die wiel, en genoeg insig, in die genade van bo, was nog altyd 'n wenresep in hierdie land.
Dankie.
Dankie.
Baie dankie. Ek wil net namens, on behalf of everybody here, thank you very much. Thank you, Marlet, Dawie, Roelof, André. It was a great discussion. Thank you very much. We enjoyed it. And from my side, we have got 2 more sessions today. You are welcome to attend these sessions. I think this was one of the best, greatest sessions that we've had in a long time. Thank you very much. And baie dankie. Geniet Nampo.